What happened to Chainsaw Man's art style? Tatsuki Fujimoto has an instantly recognizable art style that has generated plenty of memes, but lately things have felt off. Fans of the series have generally felt that Part 2 hasn't been as great as it could be lately, and while this is for a number of different reasons, the art in the more recent chapters has certainly been a big factor. But some people would argue that it doesn't look bad or that it really isn't that different. So in this video, I'd like to analyze the artistic evolution of Chainsaw Man's art style, explain why Fujimoto's manga looks so good despite some of the criticisms people might have, and explain how it's come to look and feel the way it does today. Before I start, I do have two quick disclaimers. First, as this is only concerned with the manga, this will not be covering anything about the anime. Second, because this will cover the entire manga, this video will contain some spoilers. Now, while I would argue Fujimoto has a pretty consistent art style, there seem to be four distinct stages of the art in Chainsaw Man. The first starts with chapter 1, naturally, and ends right around chapter 43, or roughly halfway through part 1. The first thing anyone notices about the art style is the line work, specifically how sketchy it is. And when I say sketchy, I mean literally sketchy, as in it looks as though Fujimoto just draws the characters and then doesn't touch them up. Now obviously, he's a professional, so of course he does, but his manga always has this unpolished sort of look. It's not a good or bad thing per se, but it definitely gives Chainsaw Man a rougher look than something like Dragon Ball. On the other hand, the world overall is really detailed. So for example, in chapter 1, when they're bringing Denji to the zombie devil, we get this panel of the building. Fujimoto could have just drawn a basic building with 4 walls and a door, but we get this very detailed depiction of where they're meeting. You can see all the individual panels on the side of the building, all the windows, the ladders and the towers behind the buildings. There's no other effect other than it just makes the world feel real. And it's an interesting contrast to the sketchy looking characters, whose character design we'll get into in just a minute. Another feature of Chainsaw Man's art style is the paneling. Actually, before I say more on that, make sure to like the video if you're enjoying it so far. It's the easiest way to support the channel, and it helps spread the video to other viewers like you. Now, paneling in Chainsaw Man is incredible, particularly in the fight scenes. I talked before how good the scenery is, but the action scenes are even more detailed. I won't say more on that just because they get a little too detailed, but the short of it is Fujimoto leaves nothing to the imagination, making the action feel visceral and exciting. But aside from the detail, the action scenes are carried out by near perfect paneling. Again, I can't show any more of the graphic stuff, but just look at Denji and Power in chapter 6. You get this perfect parallel where they both reach for their weapons and go to hit the other person at the same time. And when you turn the page, you get this big payoff where you see Power rock Denji. But it's not just action that Fujimoto does really well. Just before this, we get this page where Power brings Denji to the house where Meowie is. We see this big panel where the house is in the distance, but we get a close-up of Power pointing right towards the house, directing our attention to that small house all the way in the distance. There are tons of examples like this, and they all show Fujimoto's insane proficiency in using the medium to its full potential. Now, like I mentioned before, another thing Fujimoto is obviously great at is character designs. One thing that contributes to the Fujimoto look is the hair. In Chainsaw Man at least, hair has a pretty normal look to it. It's not as normal as something you might see in Western comics, but it's certainly a far cry from the big spiky hair of Dragon Ball. So while characters like Aki and others have some interesting looking hair, it's drawn as though it were real hair. It doesn't just stick up and defy gravity all the time. Another thing that gives Chainsaw Man characters their iconic look is the faces. In Chainsaw Man, characters usually have no shading on their faces. Usually. And there's not a whole lot of perspective, for a lack of a better term. So for example, in something like, say, One Punch Man, you can have a cartoony looking face like Saitama's, but it always has a 3-dimensional look to it because of the way Murata positions each facial feature. In Chainsaw Man, facial features almost look like they were cut and pasted on, giving the characters these very flat-looking faces. A lot of people don't like it, but I do. I can't really give any reasons why it looks bad, and I just think it complements the rough style of this manga. On that note, now let's move on to the next stage. The second stage, which I tend to just refer to as the end of part 1 or the second half, starts around chapter 42 and ends with chapter 97. The art style doesn't change drastically in this stage, but there are some pretty big differences. Paneling was already great in Chainsaw Man, but something that's elevated even more here is the choreography. On top of the godly paneling, you get some amazing choreography in fights. The one everyone knows without mentioning is of course the fight between Quan Chi, however you say her name, and Yoshida. You can go online and find examples of where Fujimoto probably referenced movies for this scene, and it's honestly breathtaking. The action only gets better in this stage, and it's because of the choreography. Now, remember how I said Fujimoto used the medium to its fullest? Well, obviously, we can see this in the paneling and the fights. But another way this improves in the second stage is with words. Fujimoto doesn't just focus on pictures like a lot of artists. Fujimoto is unique in that he uses words to their full potential as well. Obviously, as a manga, Fujimoto uses a bunch of onomatopoeias. But probably my favorite example of words and how they're used is the scene with Reze when she speaks Russian. Here, we don't get any kind of explanation or anything. We just see Reze's words suddenly depicted in Russian characters. So it does a few things. Obviously it tells us she's speaking Russian. Another thing it does is blocks us out unless we know how to read Russian. One other thing it does is it allows us to know something the other characters don't. So the characters here don't speak Russian. But if we know Russian or we use the characters to get a translation, then we can learn something by using this language. This shows us that words mean something in Chainsaw Man. They aren't just tools to carry the plot. It's not something a lot of artists do, and it's what makes Chainsaw Man unique. Now, those are the big changes. But before I move on, there are a couple other things worth noting. First, it's worth mentioning that line work is thinner in this stage. It's not a huge difference per se, but when the line work is as sketchy as it is, it makes that sketchiness stand out less. Finally, noses get much smaller in this stage. When you look back, Fujimoto draws noses rather big in early Chainsaw Man. So you'll notice in the end of part 1 and onward that this changes and the noses shrink somewhat. But now let's move on to the third stage. This stage, which I just call early part 2, starts with chapter 98 and ends right around chapter 128. For the most part, part 2 retains a lot of what worked well in the later stage of part 1. There's really only two changes here. First would be the line work. Here we can see where Fujimoto might have been influenced by his break from Chainsaw Man. In case you aren't aware, Fujimoto took a break after part 1 for maybe a year or so, and this time he came out with Look Back and Goodbye Eri. Now, I'm not going to dictate a whole segment to dissecting those one-shots, but obviously, they're not identical to Chainsaw Man. And in part 2, we see the line work go back in the direction of early part 1. It's not as thin as the end of part 1, but it's not the super thick line work of early part 1 either. It's more balanced, rounding out the overall look and capturing the best of both worlds, retaining that rough look while still taking advantage of some of the looser drawings of that second stage. Another thing I noticed about part 2 is that there seems to be more of these deadpan type panels. To be fair, this was something we had already seen in part 1, but in part 2, Fujimoto really leans into them. Again, I think this could be argued as another influence from his one-shots he did, because he does a lot of them in those, but for whatever reason, we get more of them, and they're great. While a lot of artists do this, Fujimoto has a certain way of doing it where it can exude perfect comedic timing and existential dread all in the same moment. But like I said, that's really it. Part 2 doesn't change all that much from part 1. That is, until later on. Which brings us to the final stage. The last stage starts right around the end of the Fall Devil arc, so like chapter 129 or so, and runs up right through the current chapters. And this is where we start to see why people don't like how part 2 looks. First of all, the line work continues in the same trend, and now it's thicker than ever. Which in other manga is great, but when you have the sketchy designs of Chainsaw Man, it just makes everything look messy. Aside from that, everything just looks messier in the newer chapters of part 2. I'm not going to stand here and say Fujimoto suddenly forgot how to draw, but there's more than a few things that make me wonder what's going on in the background. For example, in chapter 160, we get a lot of the Katana Devil. And, out of context, he doesn't look so bad. Well, sort of. You can see how his teeth kind of just meld into his face more than usual, making it harder to distinguish them. And the hands look pretty messy. But, that's regular old Chainsaw Man, right? Well, not so much. let's look at the original drawings of the Katana Devil. Let's go back to chapter 37. In this panel, Katana Man still has a pretty rough design, but when we compare him to his depiction in chapter 160, it's like night and day. The hat has a clearer emblem on it, the teeth aren't just this big mess, the jaw has more details and angles. The panel in chapter 37 is objectively better no matter how you spin it, and it's examples like this that just go to show how the art right now just isn't that great. Couple that with the fact that we don't really get paneling like we used to, or choreography or detail like we used to, and the art just feels like an all-around downgrade. Does this mean the art style is going to get worse and worse? No. Like I said in my previous video, I just think we're in an awkward transition phase right now. While the earlier stages obviously look better, I think we can look forward to something entirely unique in the chapters to come. But on that note, I'd like to share a few general thoughts on the art style as I close out the video. First, I think the rough approach to the art style is what makes it so special. It's weird because it kinda looks lazy. But that's the same thing Akira Toriyama said about Dragon Ball, and obviously everything in that manga looks gorgeous. So you could argue it's a deliberate choice by Fujimoto to highlight everything else. It's also fitting for the tone of Chainsaw Man given that this is a very gritty, harsh world that the story takes place in. Aside from that, it's worth noting that, oddly enough, Fujimoto is really good at drawing animals. Kinda random, I know, but when you've read Hiro Mashima like I have, and you've seen how funky looking some of his animal drawings are, you appreciate the cats and dogs in Chainsaw Man that much more. In any event, Chainsaw Man has a very unique look to it. It's because Fujimoto uses the medium to its fullest and makes a lot of deliberate yet subtle choices. It's for these reasons and more that although Part 2 doesn't look so great right now, I have no doubt that Chainsaw Man will always stand out as one of the most unique looking stories in manga. But now I'd like to hear what you think. How would you describe Chainsaw Man's art style? How would you rate Chainsaw Man's current chapters? Share your thoughts and say what everyone else has to say down in the comments. I'll pick my favorite and share it as comment of the week on my community tab. And if you'd like another discussion like this one, then check out my video on Jujutsu Kaisen. In that video, I explain the artistic evolution of JJK's art style. You can find that video in the playlist linked right here. Until then, thank you for watching, and I hope to hear from you soon.